The Bible is one of the most referenced books in the world. Over the last few decades, an intense religious and scientific debate has been building around the idea of ETs in the Bible. In 2014, the Center for Theological Inquiry, a research institute in New Jersey, was awarded $1.1 million by NASA to study, quote, the societal implications of astrobiology, unquote. In other words, what would the overall impact be on religions if they were to discover we're not alone in the universe? Is it possible that a distant race of ancient aliens once inhabited the lands of the Bible, and if so, are we part of their legacy?
When we're reading the Bible, we always have to look to the first page to see which version of the Bible are you reading. The New International Version, the New International Version, the King James Version, the St. Jerome Version. Which version are you reading? Because the language is going to be different. So if we were to write, for example, the ET version of the Bible, we'd go back to every story where it says, and the heavens opened, and realize they're talking about a stargate. What else could be the heavens opening but a rip in the fabric of space-time? And so this is a way we can start to connect with what the ancients were actually seeing or experiencing. Their language was different from ours. They would say, the heavens opened. We would say, oh, a stargate opened. It's as much a function of language that separates us from true understanding as it is anything else.
There are so many references of extraterrestrial contact in the Bible. There are 70 verses describing clouds as vehicles, 15 verses describing pillars, 10 verses describing dwellings as vehicles, 160 verses describing lights and fire as vehicles. There's 17 verses describing spinning wheels, and also 22 verses describing dark and shining objects as vehicles. There's also 37 verses of various objects in the Bible that describe UFOs as flying furnaces and burning bushes. So as you can see, based off of the vocabulary of the people of those times, they can only use words that would help them describe what we would call nowadays UFOs.
The Bible begins with the book of Genesis, and it ends with the book of Revelations. In between are dozens of stories that reference what many scholars suggest may be extraterrestrial phenomena. Genesis 6:4 describes the sons of God coming and bearing children with the daughters of man. This begs the question, who were the sons of God?
The ultimate example of an extraterrestrial intervention in the Bible is Genesis chapter 6. This is where the fallen angels, the watcher angels, descend onto the earth plane, take on physical incarnation, and have sex with human females, creating a hybrid offspring referred to as the Nephilim. These are described as the mighty men of renown. Why is that? What does it mean to say that they're mighty men? What distinguishes a mighty man from an ordinary human? And the answer is that these fallen angels are considered to be equivalent to, if not the same as, the Anunnaki of Sumeria. The Anunnaki possessed a cloak or a garment called the Malamu that gave them superpowers. So what this is saying is that the Nephilim were the mighty humans who possessed this cloak or garment of the Anunnaki, and just like the Anunnaki, when they had the Malamu on, they're radiant, they're shining, they're luminous, and they have superpowers. So this is another hidden reference to technology in the Bible.
That kind of interaction actually talks about the Nephilim actually interbreeding with human women. That's a pretty big influence.
Inside of our DNA, there's a programming language there. It's been left by our progenitors. When we crack this code and when we figure out who we are and where we're going, we'll realize that our destiny is in the stars. Therefore, we have to ask ourselves, if we go back to the Genesis story, were these a very advanced group of geneticists that made us as a hybrid species?
There are accounts like this that have appeared, the former that I was referring to actually in the Bible itself, but other sources of ancient origins like that, such as the tablets that Zechariah was translating, that seem to be indicative of accounts of these other beings interacting with us.
Walter Matfield states in his book Eden's Serpent, Its Mesopotamian Origins, that the Garden of Eden belonged to the Anunnaki, lending more credence to the serpent not just being a biblical creature, but a member of the Anunnaki.
Let's think of the serpent in the Garden of Eden. This is some type of a reptilian type of being that we've been taught to be afraid of. It's a wisdom bearer. It's in the Gnostic Gospels, they describe it as this bright snake, this illuminated snake taking on a humanoid form. We have the winged serpents that are described in the Bible, angels as winged serpents, humanoid beings with serpentine faces that can spin their bodies into whirlwinds and can change their form. They can shapeshift right before your eyes. These are clearly another class of beings. So I think what's going to have to happen here is we're going to have to broaden our perspective on the possibility of what other creatures could actually look like or be like.
The Garden of Eden story also appears in the book of Ezekiel, where over the course of 12 different verses, there is mention of possible extraterrestrial encounters.
One of the all-time great extraterrestrial craft references in the Bible is Ezekiel chapter 1, verses 1 through 28. Ezekiel is one of these wise men from the Temple of Solomon who's been deported to Babylon. He's sitting by the river Chebar, and he describes in his own words, the heavens open. The heavens open. Okay, this is a rip in the fabric of space-time. And he next describes something absolutely phenomenal. He says there's a cloud with this brightness about it, and it's flashing like lightning.
He actually saw this vessel not only land, but he actually got inside of it and it took off with the people. He thought that it was God, and they even said to him, no, we're not God. We're here to take you somewhere to meet somebody very important. So basically, it was a very, very good recorded account of a UFO that landed and that somebody got inside of and took off, went to another location to meet another being. And these beings, according to the writings, were not God. So it's very interesting to know that there's a lot of talk about not only UFOs in the Bible, but even people taking off.
When examining the Old Testament account of Ezekiel, perhaps one of the most fascinating perspectives to consider comes from Eric von Daniken, author of Chariots of the Gods.
My God, in my opinion, in my dreams, does not need a vehicle in which to move around. God is omnipresent. God is like a spirit. He's always there. Now in the Bible, the prophet Ezekiel describes a strange story. He says, all of a sudden they hear the noise in the sky. All the slaves look up there. Then he sees an object coming down from the sky. Then he realizes that the object makes a tremendous noise. He compares the noise with the thundering of a waterfall. Or he compares it with fighting wagons. So a terrible noise this object made. All the slaves looking there, the object comes down, sand is blown up. Ezekiel is high priest by profession, so he believes in the beginning it must be God. He felt on his nose to pray to the Lord. And then he realized this is not God. And then he describes exactly what he sees. The wings moved. When the wings moved, that the tremendous noise started to be there again. When the wings stood still, they were hanging down. He describes the leg. He clearly says the leg were out of metal. Then he cries the wheel, and the wheel shocked him totally, because the wheel of his times can go forward and backward. But the wheel which he sees here, They go also forward and backward, but at the same time, left and right, without making a steering movement. Ezekiel sees a wheel which goes forward, backward, right and left without making a steering movement. This shocks him so he cannot understand it. He describes it 4 times. Some 30 years ago, I had a secret speech at the headquarters at NASA in Huntsville, in the United States. On this speak, I also talk about 5 minutes about Ezekiel. And after the speech, we had a dinner together, and there was the chief of the Department of Construction, an ex-German, his name was Joseph Brumrich, who came to me and said, that was very interesting, but Mr. von Däniken, in the Bible, you will never find technology. The Bible, this is imagination. These are dreamings, visions, but not technology. He started to read Ezekiel, and finally he realized that whatever Ezekiel described is real, and he started to reconstruct Ezekiel's description. The outcome was a book with the English title, The Spaceship of Ezekiel. And in the foreword of it, Mr. Joe Blumrich, the ex-chief of the construction department at NASA, said, I absolutely started this work to disprove Erich von Däniken's story of Ezekiel. But it was absolutely sensational what comes out. Ezekiel did saw an extraterrestrial spacecraft. Now, Ezekiel's spaceship is not a mother spaceship with which you can move from star to star. Ezekiel's spaceship is only an object which today we would call space shuttle. You have to have a mother spaceship, and from the mother spaceship, a smaller vehicle comes down to the Earth. So that's what it was. Now, this is very important. I knew the original Ezekiel. I read it first in Hebrew. I did not learn specially Hebrew, but we had a Latin translation. And in the original Ezekiel, the word God never appears, never. Ezekiel says it was the splendorness of the highest. The word God in the Bible only comes in later by the translators. The translator, the splendorness of the highest, he means God. In the original, the word God is never mentioned. So he continues in the book of Ezekiel and he says that the splendorness of the highest arrived a second time. And this time, the hand of the highest put him on the throne. In my view, he was sitting in the co-pilot's chair. And then he describes how they started. He says, and the hand of the highest pressed upon my chest because he feels the gravity when starting. He does not know where the trip goes because he says, they brought me on a very, very high mountain. He doesn't know where he is. He looks down and he sees under him something like a city, a small city or a big village. And in the center of it, something like a temple. The splendorness of the Lord comes to a standstill over the temple. Slowly, slowly, he sinks inside the so-called temple. And Ezekiel realized at that moment that the noise of the wings were this time higher and louder than what he had heard before in the desert, because now the echo comes back from the walls of the so-called temple. Then it comes to a standstill. Ezekiel gets out of the space shuttle, and of a sudden a glittering being appears again, one of the strangers, and he says to Ezekiel, oh humans, you have eyes to see, but you see nothing. And you have ears to hear, but you hear nothing. And then the man in glittering suit gives Ezekiel a measuring device and orders him to measure this whole building, the so-called temple. Ezekiel, in the meantime, he understands that this has nothing to do with God. So he has courage. He asks back to the glittering man, why? Why should I measure this temple? And the other one says, that's the reason why we brought you here, humans. So Ezekiel starts to measure length and wide and how many stairs, etc. All this you can read in the Bible, all the measurements of the so-called temple. Now in Germany, we had a German engineer, his name is Hans Herbert Bayer. And he read these measurements and he asked himself, is this a true building? Or is it just imagination, fantasy? And he started to calculate exactly according to Ezekiel's measurement. And out comes a building which looks today like a stadium, like a football stadium. And then this German engineer came to me, and I saw his calculations, absolutely precise. I asked him, have you ever heard of NASA, of Mr. Blumrich's reconstruction? Because NASA did only reconstruct the splendorness of the highest, which means the shuttle, while the German engineer was only reconstructing the so-called temple. So one have the splendorness of the highest and the temple. So I brought the two men together, the German engineer and the NASA engineer. And the space shuttle fit perfectly into the temple by every centimeter. The so-called temple was nothing else but the base station for the extraterrestrial shuttle. It was not God, it was simply the space shuttle of the extraterrestrials.